I have been good. I hope you're good too.
You've been missed. Anyway, since we've already kept people waiting, I don't think we should be talking so much. We have to just set the ball rolling. Hello everyone, my name is Helena, and I have with me Emmanuel Gyimah. He is a public health professional, and he specializes in nutrition research. He's also a PhD student, and I'm very excited to have him here today. He's going to talk to us about ultra processed foods. And so, Manny,
Yes.
the floor is yours. Ultra processed food. What are they?
Okay. Sometimes it can be hard to define, but let me start off with this thing we call the NOVA classification. So there's a.
Could you please speak louder? I think I'm struggling to hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now? 1 2 1 2 1 2. Can you hear me? Oh, you know why? Because my microphone is. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you if you could speak a little louder.
Is it okay if I turn this way, because that's the only way in which the microphone might work. Okay. Okay. So can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So first of all, sometimes when we're talking about ultra processed foods, you hear people talking about processed foods, but then the key word or the key part of the phrase is ultra. So then there's this classification we call the NOVA food classification, and actually, no. Okay. The NOVA food classification, and we have 4 categories. So the first one is unprocessed or minimally processed foods. And then the second is processed culinary ingredients. And then we have processed foods. And then the 4th level is ultra processed foods. So when you think about it, think of these levels as degree of processing is increasing. So with something like unprocessed foods, think of an apple. And then if the apple keeps taking different changes all the way down to ultra processed foods, the more it gets farther from the original apple that it was, then it becomes ultra processed foods. So with the first level of the NOVA classification.
Let me cut you here. You said the more the apple grows through change.
Yes.
What kind of changes are you referring?
Okay, so that's what I'm going to try and explain. So, like, for example, the first level, we have the first NOVA level, group 1, which is processed, or minimally processed or unprocessed foods. You're thinking of something like an egg or just something in its finest form. Or let's say if you have corn and you mill it, it's gone through some level of processing, but it's minimally processed. You haven't added anything. Then the second level, we have culinary ingredients. So for example, palm oil, or like processed culinary ingredients. So palm oil goes through some processing, like in our households. So for example, you're making palm nut soup and then you skim off the oil. That is a level of processing for a culinary ingredient. Then the third level is like processed foods. So here there might be some like additives added, but just for like preservation, or just like think of things like fermentation, so just basic processing. And then at the 4th level,
not everyone knows fermentation.
Okay, fermentation. What is fermentation? Basically, just
so we want to. Can we? You're talking about the different levels.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So is it? And you talked about the NOVA classification. So are we saying that the ultra processed foods is one of the NOVA?
Yes.
NOVA food classification.
Yes. So the first category is unprocessed or minimally processed. Then the second is processed culinary ingredients. Then the third is processed. Then the 4th is ultra processed. So then, so we're talking about, for example, fermentation, which might mean just leaving something out there so that just develops some flavor. So if it's like, for example, most of us know about corn dough, where you just leave it out for like 3 days before you freeze it or store it. That's some level of fermentation. Or anything which is like dried to some extent. In some cases, there might be some additives. So for example, we have like sugar-coated nuts. That is an example of just processing. Then when you go to ultra processing, so I had mentioned, for example, the apple, and then the apple has drifted way further. So if you go from apple to maybe processed apple, will probably just be like dried out apples, or like dried apple slices, or something that's been blended into like just squeezed juice, natural. Ultra processed, moving from apple to ultra processed apple, will be something where like the apple has been converted into a candy, or the apple there's been like additional additives. So usually you have like five or more ingredients, and then they usually what we usually like to give more context to consumers who usually don't understand deeper nutrition, is that think of the ingredients in ultra processed foods as things you wouldn't have easy access to within the household. So, for example, emulsifiers, those are not things that you find in every household. Whereas something like salt.
What are emulsifiers?
Emulsifiers.
I think our audience are
yes.
not that technical people. So if you could break it down for us, that would be great.
I will try. So I believe emulsifiers. What is emulsification? Emulsification is basically the breaking down of fats into droplets. So it's just usually you add certain additives to either preserve the food or just make it last longer. So like you have emulsifiers; those are like a big one. There's been lots of research on like emulsifiers and health outcomes. You have high fructose corn syrup.
So are they hazardous? Are they dangerous?
I mean, I guess when we get into the weeds of just the impacts of ultra processed foods in general, I'll say that generally small doses are probably not an issue. It's an issue of frequency and dose. So like emulsifiers, you have gums, just all these additional additives that you wouldn't recognize or use within the household. Now that's separate from just like general food fortification, because sometimes you hear people talk about processed or ultra processed foods and they're like the ingredient list is very long. But then sometimes it's a situation where they're adding nutrients to replace losses from processing. So that's different. But then the other things that are just generally added, which just to lengthen the lifespan of the food in that case, yeah.
Okay. So I don't want us to go into brands, but can you share some examples of ultra processed foods? Let's say if we take our staples, can we have some examples? If you take our foods, can we have some examples? If you take our proteins, our meats, our nuts and seeds, lentils,
yes.
Can you share some examples so that our audience can relate?
Okay, so typically most ultra processed foods will be pre-packaged foods. So if you take something like plantain chips that you're buying from the streets, that will fall somewhere within the group 2 or group 3, which is like minimally processed or just like processed, because it's basically all the stuff used for plantain chips you can find in your home: oil, salt, that kind of stuff. But then if you look at like your big brand potato chips that you would probably buy, those will usually be ultra processed, because just again, there's that idea of we want to lengthen the lifespan and we have all these additional ingredients added. So that would be one. Most ice creams will be ultra processed. And also just always, again, the baseline, the easy thing is usually just like big industry pre-packaged foods. So most ice cream brands will usually be ultra processed. Again, when you look at the ingredients, most of the stuff are not things that are available in your average household. If you look at, for example, hot chocolate, so like there's just like the raw cocoa powder, which may fall somewhere in the like minimally processed or unprocessed, because you've done some processing of raw cocoa into that. Whereas if you go with something where like sugar has been added, there are probably additional preservatives and all of that stuff compared to natural cocoa. That, on the other hand, would be like ultra processed. And most of your candies, just think outside of, let's say, your condensed milk toffee that you probably make at home. Most big brand candies will be ultra processed, because even with those, they're like no natural ingredients. So that's also one key you can use. So usually when they define them, they're usually like industrial formulations. So plantain chips, at least in the Ghanaian context, is not really much of an industrial formulation. It's mostly like very homemade, salt, oil, that kind of stuff. But then when you're looking at like other like chips brands, those the big ones, those that are made like in industrial plants will typically be ultra processed. So yeah.
All right, Annie, thank you. So, ultra processed foods have been associated with some chronic conditions. So, obesity in children and adults, it's been associated with diabetes, cardiovascular conditions, some cancers, etc. What are the statistics like? How much of ultra processed foods are we consuming? What is the future like? Because sometimes I listen to some webinars and it looks scary when you look at the numbers. So that if we have a large number of our population consuming ultra processed foods and these are associated with these health conditions, then it means that we have a sick population for our future.
Yes. Okay. So generally, I can't really give you concrete numbers, but then just globally, the amount of ultra processed foods within the food system continues to increase. And in nutrition, we like to, in public health nutrition, we talk about this thing called the nutrition transition, which means that a lot of populations are transitioning from like a particular like diet to a more Western diet, which is full of like ultra processed foods, high fat, high sugar. So generally, we find that the trend is increasing and the food supply is generally large. Now, with that being said, it's usually like, even though we link ultra processed foods to these poor outcomes, again, it's a question of dose as well as dietary patterns. So it's a different situation if majority of your diet is ultra processed foods versus little. So it's not like any ultra processed foods will lead to this. It's mostly a question of, is that a huge proportion of your energy intake? That kind of thing. So even though there's worry.
How huge is huge? So how huge is huge? So we've said that it's associated with a number of chronic conditions. So let's take biscuits, for example. Will you consider them as ultra processed food? And how much would one consume? I know it will depend on who is consuming, probably their nutritional status, their health status, other foods that they may be consuming, or how much will people consume to have them be put in a category of high risk?
So I think
these chronic conditions.
Yes, it's usually very population specific, but then usually you have to look at it within the context of the whole diet as well as their lifestyle, right? So like if you're eating a lot of biscuits, that might probably displace your ability to eat like other things. Sometimes it's hard to quantify, but you have to look at your whole diet. So, for example, when you look at studies within the US, they find that people who eat more ultra processed foods have low diet quality because the ultra processed foods end up displacing your vegetable intake, your fruit intake, all that good stuff. So, which is why it's hard to quantify. But then sometimes these numbers have been thrown randomly that ideally you should aim for just about 20% of your total intake for the day should just be ultra processed foods. If you decide to
20%?
Yes, roughly. And then 80% should be more of like whole stuff. Yes.
Does it mean that these are foods we cannot avoid? Because I feel like 20% is
you really can't avoid it. Because for example, in the US, for like when you look at bread within the US, for example, when you read the ingredients, you're like, this is definitely ultra processed. Most breakfast cereals, like just your regular box breakfast cereal, is probably ultra processed, just based on sugar, coloring, all of that stuff that has been added. So it's almost unavoidable. And even as people are even making these transitions to plant-based diets, for example, where and then you have all of these substitutes like meat substitutes, egg substitutes, all of those end up being ultra processed. There's even been this debate around plant-based milk because just sometimes just to preserve the quality, just to increase the sensory properties. And that's one aspect about ultra processed food is that the things that are added change the sensory properties. So that's to say that it just they they adapt the properties so it tastes better to you. So they change the texture, they change the taste, they might improve the color so that it just looks different to you. So then they're inevitably a part of our diets, which is why I always insist that it's a question of the dose and how like that is within how that plays within like your entire dietary pattern instead of just like any ultra processed foods. And also, I feel like everyone would be miserable if we couldn't eat ice cream once in a while. Yeah. So,
Did you say everyone would be miserable?
Yes, ice cream is good for life.
I don't think I'm an ice cream person. But anyway. Anyway, so are there evidences?
Yes.
Do we have evidence to show that ultra processed foods are associated with health conditions?
Oh,
and
yes.
Has there been research here? Yeah.
Yes, because almost
share some with us.
Yes, almost consistently. So I usually work in the realm of child nutrition, and last year I published a study in the British Journal of Nutrition, which was looking at ultra processed foods and associations with stunted growth, which means that the child is like too short for their age, right? And we found a positive association between the frequency of ultra processed food consumption and stunted growth. And similar findings have been found, and this is specifically for young children, so like ages 2 to 5. And I believe there's been some research that's been done by some folks at the Helen Keller Institute. The author she's called Dr. Priest, Pries. She's also done stuff on ultra processed snack food consumption, and it's usually associated with poor growth outcomes in children. So usually when we think of ultra processed foods, we think of obesity, overnutrition, all that stuff. But like now we're also seeing that because it affects diet quality, ends up also being associated with just inadequate intake of the ideal nutrients that you want for growth or just for health in children as well as in adults. I'd mentioned emulsifiers. That has been widely studied, particularly like in animal models. They find that it disrupts the gut microbiome, and the gut microbiome is also like helpful in reducing inflammation. It's also useful in reducing your risk of high cholesterol, reducing just a lot of poor outcomes. So emulsifiers have been associated with disruption of just like the gut microbiome. And I recently
And they are always part of the processed foods.
Yes,
Are we emulsifiers. Saying that emulsifiers are always part of the processed foods, or they are required for food processing?
They're often you find them in most ultra processed foods, and there have usually with ultra processed foods you end up finding mostly observational evidence, which is like basically asking people what do you eat and then you associate that with an outcome. But then there have been clinical trials where they've actually given people dietary emulsifiers and they found like poor gut outcomes. So that is definitely one. Then there are always a lot of studies on sugar sweetened beverages in particular. I don't know about, so I know in the US, there's always this issue with high fructose corn syrup, where there's just a lot of fructose in our soft drinks here. And fructose in particular is not something, it's almost like it's vestigial. We don't really use it as much. So when it's in excess, it just pretty much goes to your liver and that's it. And it'll be converted into fat. So sugar sweetened beverages in like observational studies as well as like trials in humans, they have found that it increases liver within your fats within your liver. And excessive fats within the liver is not a good thing because if like basic nutrition knowledge, fat soluble vitamins. If you have and your liver is also where you process a lot of like your nutrients. So once you have a lot of fat in there, it means that a lot of like your fat soluble nutrients are not even available for you to use. So fructose, which is really found in most soft drinks as well as a lot of just sweetened snacks. Those are always implicated in like outcomes which are related to just having excessive fat in your tummy area or in your liver as well. So those are always big things that you're always thinking about. I would say that generally most, like, sometimes when you look at nutrition evidence, for example, with red meat, the evidence is always mixed, but with ultra processed foods, it's always consistently negative. And another thing that is important to mention is that sometimes I talked about dietary patterns, um, which means that lifestyle choices are important. I was reading a paper that came out very recently showed that excessive consumption of sugar sweetened beverages is not, the impact of that is not even counteracted by frequent physical activity. So, which means that sometimes you may be trying to balance something out with just another just healthy way of living, like exercise, and may not necessarily counteract the impacts of that. So, there's definitely a lot of evidence that just shows that, again, the keyword is excessive or just too much. Or if it's just way more, it's just a majority of your daily diet. So it's not necessarily the fact that any ultra processed foods is related to this poor outcome. It's mostly the fact that if you have too much of it, that's when it's associated with all of these poor outcomes. And sometimes these things are associations. I also just read a study about chronic kidney disease where they followed people over a long period of time, and they found that excessive or increased consumption of ultra processed foods was associated with chronic kidney disease. Sometimes it's hard to figure out what these mechanisms are, but then you definitely find consistent associations with poor outcomes. So, yeah. I cannot hear you. I cannot hear you. No. The sound just disappeared. Can you hear me? Mm. Oh. Hmm. Let me see. Oh. Yeah, I've lost all sound. uh, hmm. Hmm.